Thank you, Lorraine. Those are very, very kind words, and very much appreciated. They're words which warm my heart in ways that my days here in Limerick have warmed my heart from the moment I arrived at Shannon Airport to this moment, and will continue through the rest of this day. I echo your thoughts and your thanks to all of the students, the postgraduate students who are here, from whom it was for me a great pleasure and an honor to learn. I learn by listening to you. I move ahead by listening to you and seeing what the future will be. And I look forward to being your collaborator in that future. I want to say just a few quick words of thanks. Additionally, first of all, to Lorraine Byrne-Bodley, President of SMI, and to Helen Lawler, the President of ICTM Ireland. Both of you have been so kind to me that I appreciate, and I appreciate that intellectual welcome that you have given me, making me feel very much at home. I especially want to thank the student team that has been so helpful to me, the organizers, and I think it's important to name them by names. Anna Camilo, Kira Thompson, Halle Jaber, and Felix Morgenstern. They've been remarkable, especially, I have to say, in making sure that I had a hot cup of coffee and that the sandwiches were okay and that everything was just fine. That means a lot. I must say thank you so much. I dedicate my remarks today to the memory of Bruno Nettl. And it's particularly whose death was made known to me when I was contacted by his grandson, the ethnomusicologist Stefan Fiol, as I was doing final preparations for this trip. He passed away on Wednesday at the age of 89. It's particularly appropriate, I think, to think of Bruno Nettl and at this conference for several reasons. And it's for those reasons that I doubly want to dedicate my remarks to him today. First of all, there is probably no musicologist who has so consistently throughout his entire career dedicated himself to all of the musicologies, to the fact that the musicologies are part of the same desire to understand music, to understand its place in the world. Perhaps the best evidence of this is the article on music in Grove Music Online, which Bruno Nettl wrote after years when there was no article on music in the Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians. And Bruno said, "How can you have a dictionary of music and musicians and there's no article on music?" And if you read that article, you will encounter remarkable generosity. The second reason that it's appropriate to remember Bruno today is that, probably not known to most of you, Bruno Nettl was a refugee. He fled the Nazis with his family, his father Paul Nettl, the musicologist, and his mother Gertrude Nettl, the great pianist, in 1939. They fled and were settled in the United States after great difficulties. And for this reason, he had a sense of migration and refugees throughout his life, particularly in these last few years. Bruno Nettl was able to flee the Nazis in 1939, but also he also lived a life remembering the fact, and he never spoke about this, that his 3 living grandparents were unable to leave Prague at the time, and they were placed in a concentration camp and only one of them survived. So my remarks today very much acknowledge a life that in some ways is mirrored by the life of Bruno Nettl. So let me begin with a few words of introduction, the journey beyond its end. Borders, walls, the sea, they course through Irish literature and song, through Irish history, the existential fabric of time and topography, as material and metaphor, as the journey that comes to its end only to return to its beginning. The song searching for yet another strophe sounded to stave off silence. The inevitability of believing in what lies beyond. The collective chorus assailing the placelessness of the very place claimed by borders and walls. The swell of the music from the movement of migrants in all possible forms, immigrants, emigrants, the masses struggling to pass. It is in search of the sounded world of borders, walls, and seas that I come to Limerick this week, and I invite you to join me during this hour, and perhaps beyond, as song provides me with the means to chart what I call the aesthetic topography of migration and refugees. Already at the outset of our journey, we recognize irony and paradox. To understand journey and its conditions, we turn with an analytical lens instead to the very structures that prevent it. Walls and borders are the physical barriers to migration, and as such, the very antithesis of freedom that mobility affords. Passage is interrupted, arrested. Music's intrinsic mobility must confront its terminus, silence. Today, however, I should like to challenge us to rethink the metaphors and the materiality of migration. If the world of mobility is inverted, turned inside out, I should ask us to listen in a different way, more active and activist, to those moments sounded with a music that belies the silence. I ask us to listen into the silence, hence also beyond the silence. I also ask us, as I so often do, to gather at a juncture of music scholarship, in which we seek common approaches that we can and must collectively implement. With the songs I choose today, I shall move historically, and I shall also clear the space of ethnographic moments in the present. If walls and borders both separate and conjoin, so too shall I embrace that irony to enrich what I believe is the common grounding that all of you gathered here in Limerick share. Throughout my remarks, then, I shall be led by song, indeed by songs that I have chosen because of the ways they lead us to walls and borders. The journey upon which song takes me follows those upon which the great modern theorist of song, Johann Gottfried Herder, embarked in the Enlightenment of the late 18th century. For Herder, too, song made it possible to rechart history as the common experience of humanity. Herder would write, Gesang liebt Menge, song loves the masses. Song, he wrote, it will again be what it once was, sensitive to the entire being of life, speaking from the human heart, with God, with itself, with all of nature. End of this citation from his Ossian writings. Song and Herder also mark for me a moment of personal return, which I should like to acknowledge. For when I first spoke at the University of Limerick in February 2007, they were also my subjects. And I was so privileged to listen to song, past and present, with Micheál O'Sullivan, whose life so eloquently symbolized the transcendence of song. Part 1. She played the harp and sang a new song. The journey of song I follow today begins in 1510 with one of the oldest ballads to circulate in the medieval and early modern Mediterranean world, Der Graf von Rom, the Count of Rome. The ballad overflows with the symbols and narratives upon which I shall draw today. The Count of Rome is an exemplary case of the musical and poetic subgenre known as captivity narrative, whose topoi form from a counterpoint with cultural encounter and its offshoots, migration and flight. The Count sails from Rome across the Mediterranean on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem when he is captured, presumably by naval vessels of Ottoman Turkey, and then imprisoned. To save him, his wife dresses as a monk, gains an audience in the court of the captors, and by playing music on her harp, wins the release of her husband. All in one, The Count of Rome is a ballad about the origins of song, the encounter between Christianity and Islam, and the navigation of the Mediterranean as the cultural border between Europe and Asia. It is not by chance that such images, both local and universal, are familiar to us in the history of Irish song. A few verses from the middle of the ballad itself. The wife knew how to read and write, and other ways of passing the time as well. She also could play the harp and violin and other string instruments as well. She placed good strings on her harp and lute. She followed the emissary to travel across the sea. So she played on the harp and sang a new song, full of courtliness and artistry, that which resounded through the palace. The pagans began to dance once it had become night, for during these events the Count received the message. Just as the text of the Count of Rome tells tales of the sea and movement across it, so too does the context. This oldest printed version of the ballad was itself the product of migration. It was the work of Jewish printers working in northern Italy, where they established a workshop upon fleeing Spain, from which Jews and Muslims had been expelled less than 2 decades earlier in 1492. The printed version bears witness to remarkable intertextuality, for it uses Hebrew orthography, as you see, albeit for a text variant that is in Mittelhochdeutsch, that is to say, it's not in Yiddish or Ladino. In the journey of song I follow today, I myself navigate this sea of intertextuality and intercontextuality, above all in search of the archaeology and architecture that facilitated or obstructed migration across history. Already you have seen the ways in which I engage in an archaeology of early sources, and I do so to construct an historical picture of the longue durée, critical if we are to understand the refugee and migration crises of our own time. With this historical sweep in mind, I should like to turn to another early source, deliberately to connect past and present, another ballad about walls, borders, and the sea, a ballad called Die Juden, the Jewish woman. And I dare to sing, although I'm not in good voice, but how can I help it here in Limerick. So I'll sing in the German. It's High German, you might note. Ballads are in High German, wherever they come from, in the oral tradition of the German language. The two beginning strophes and the final two strophes. Es war einmal ein Jöden, ein wunderschönes Weib, die hatte eine Tochter, zum Tod war sie bereit. Die hatte eine Tochter, zum Tod war sie bereit. Ach, Mutter, liebste Mutter, mir tut der Kopf so weh, lass mich eine kleine Weile spazieren gehen am See. Lass mich eine kleine Weile spazieren gehen am See. Now the final two strophes. Da gab sie ihm ein Ringlein aus allerfeinstem Gold. Da gab sie ihm ein Ringlein, das soll dein eigen sein. Da gab sie ihm ein Ringlein, das soll dein eigen sein. Dann stieg sie auf die Mauer, stürzten ab in den Köhlensee. Leb wohl, du liebe Heimat, wir sehen uns nimmermehr. Leb wohl, du liebe Heimat, wir sehen uns nimmermehr. It's one thing about being a cabaret player, you're shameless. There are many reasons that I locate this German and Jewish ballad in a history that stretches from the Middle Ages to the present. First of all, the variant you heard was recorded near Lake Constance in Vorarlberg in Western Austria, sung by two survivors of the Shoah, Mina and Luisa Federspiel. The singers were themselves refugees in the 1940s. The history of a moment, local and for the sisters intimate, intersects then with the historical longue durée of the song itself. Second, like Der Graf von Rom, Die Jöden narrates history, and it does so cumulatively over time. The earliest written version dates from the 14th century, with variants in printed sources stretching across headers, Volkslieder, des Knaben Wunderhorn, and settings by Brahms and Yiddish songwriters. This is the Brahms setting called Es war einmal eine Jöden from 1893. The narrative of the ballad itself tells the tale of a young Jewish woman who leaves the ghetto, her Heimat, in search of her lover, but takes her own life after learning he is drowned in the sea. Her search is unidirectional, as flight into death in the sea. Finally, the story of the Jewish woman itself is framed by walls, and they force her to perform her flight in specific ways. At the beginning, she must jump from the wall of the ghetto, springing to the street below, the Judengasse that forms the medieval border she must cross. In the final verse, she climbs the wall only to jump into the sea, and ending her own life with suicide. Part 2. Non Perpetuum Mobile, the Archaeology and Architecture of Aesthetic Topography. Music scholarship has long accounted for the many ways in which music and musicians displayed, indeed depended on, mobility. Modern music scholarship has combined both the objective and subjective dimensions of music and human agency to develop theories that account for the acceleration of mobility in the 20th and 21st centuries. Folk music scholarship has turned increasingly towards studies of identity, especially that afforded by music to immigrant and ethnic communities. Certainly in my days as a student, this is what we studied when we studied folk music. The globalization of diaspora and the musics that were nurtured by societies aspiring to return to the homelands from which they had been forced brought about new ways of accounting for the centrality of mobility in music and by musicians themselves. The presence of music in transnational flows, whether motivated by the search for economic advantage through migration, or the result of the violence that forces refugees to search for survival, has become critical for 21st century music scholarship. It is precisely because of the centrality of mobility in music's ontology, historically and in the 21st century, that walls are important and deserve critical attention from music scholarship. Walls are the antithesis of mobility, disrupting all that movement affords to shaping musical subjectivity. In order to confront the disruptive presence of walls theoretically, I take the opportunity of this postgraduate conference to propose and expand upon what I more generally call aesthetic topography, attending today to the ways song, sounded across time and space, can make itself transcendent. The theoretical usefulness of this concept grows because it accounts for contradictory musical landscapes in which mobility is interrupted and prevented. And I'll turn to some of that now. Part 3, parallel and paradox, migration and Mauer. Mauer is the German word for wall. The paths of migrants and the walls that intersect them spread across the soundscape of modernity, sounding the cartographies of pasts and presents, dissonant because of the competition for space and the unequal distribution of power. It is the premise of my reflections this afternoon that borders, walls, and migration are component parts of the same theme, generated in historically common moments, but necessarily destabilizing them. Borders and walls are both metaphor and materiality, over time leading to the challenge of the 21st century that migrants must confront. When migration is attacked as a threatening specter, as a crisis, or an invasion, political fearmongers are quick to call for the building of walls to contain it. The walls designed to stem migration may be imagined to be big and beautiful in Donald Trump's litany, but in reality, their architecture aims to silence the voices of those calling out to cross. The historical contingency of the political economy of walls notwithstanding, the ways in which they interrupt mobility and migration have been globalized in the 21st century, perhaps more than ever before. Accordingly, as I turn to specific instances in the course of my remarks today, I do so with the hope that a theory of walls and migration might account for the global and the historical. It is precisely in this sense, I believe, that song, with its performative and narrative attributes, serves us particularly well. Among the ways in which walls could potentially bring an end to the migrant's journey, therefore, would be to silence her voice. It is that function of silencing, however, that may actually be the very fissure in the wall. This afternoon, I turn to the confrontation on the global geography of mobility and migration, where the routes of migrants are almost always determined by walls and the three narrative functions that they make possible. And here are these three narratives in the broadest possible way of thinking about them. First of all, the wall as a site of silence. Second, the wall as a site of mediation and passage. Third, the wall as a contact zone in which new narratives are possible. Walls are important to the historical longue durée because they both silence and amplify soundscapes. And this paradox is, I believe, critical. Walls keep sounds out. They trap sound and performance in contact zones. And yet sound also passes through them, over them, and beyond them, indeed connecting and affording agency to the world's walls otherwise separate. Part 4, a season of walls, the legacy of migration, the sound of silence. In many parts of the world, surely in Europe, we find ourselves in the midst of a season of walls. In the United States, along the Mexican border, it is an extended season already. That season is signaled by anniversaries, the return to the walls and borders of the past, metaphorical and material, which have historically marked the borders that force migrants and refugees to reroute their journeys. Brexit is certainly one of those reminders of what walls can and will do. It has become customary to celebrate the anniversaries that fill the season of walls, returning to the sites of borders, both crossed and catastrophic. The sounding of these anniversaries becomes also the soundtrack of history, the incessant return and repetition of themes that constitute the versions and variants of those seeking passage. I witnessed this season of walls in the several worlds in which I myself live and work, even as they converge in a stretto of everydays. First of all, in Chicago, the global city still called into being by migrants. Chicago is the city of the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing the legacy of slavery in the South. It's also now the site of the swelling Latinx neighborhoods, filled by those crossing the borders to Latin America, making new lives in a city proudly proclaiming itself a sanctuary city. Jerusalem, another of my homes, whose historical tangle of walls defines and defies migration and border crossing more each year. And Berlin, my European home, now the home too for some 1 million migrants and refugees. It is on the walls of such global cities that the historical longue durée of migration is incessantly written, once again in this season of walls. Please permit me to turn briefly to Berlin to reflect on its current season of walls, most notably celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall 30 years ago. The Berlin Wall does not, however, represent a single moment or even period of border separation in this season of walls, but rather the long history of borders that has led to fissure and failure in Central Europe. The Berlin Wall disappeared not in the least after its so-called fall. As fragments, it has been redeployed and reimagined, transformed into the aesthetic topography of historical moments past and present. Fragments of the wall that were not originally artworks, therefore, acquire aesthetic functions when they undergo transition and repurposing, something that I see every day when I'm in Berlin. The fragments serve as the landscapes and the soundscape of the German everyday. They're also museumized and memorialized incessantly, but in this season of walls, in an exhibition at the museum in which history and the avant-garde most frequently converge, the Gropiusbau. It is at the Gropiusbau, whose front entrance opens directly onto the former wall, that we might witness the installations by 28 international artists who are assembled under the rubric of walking through walls, durch Mauern gehend. In order to mobilize the installations historically and globally, the action of walking through, walking or gehen, is sounded with music in as many as half of the installations. An amazing array of media mobilizes the walking through walls. Musically, from colonized Africans singing the German national anthem in multiple languages simultaneously, to an orchestra playing Tchaikovsky in besieged Sarajevo. And I want to give you just a sample of some of these installations so that you might see this remarkable exhibit, which is still up. This is the cover of the exhibition catalog. Here you see immediately, actually in the period after the wall, a young woman and the wall and the world behind it. The photographer here for the cover, but also of this particular image, is Cedille Bergmann, and this is simply a photograph called Mauer, taken in 1990, and you can see the way in which this it becomes a site for this increasing density of text and a sort of aestheticizing that grows from it. A very different installation, this one called Mother's Day, which is an installation which represents the way in which the border in the Golan Heights created by the Israeli occupation prevents Druze families from talking to each other and hearing each other. And it represents the way, and the recording itself, in which on Mother's Day, children come to the wall, and through the wall they sing to their mothers whom they can't otherwise reach. Here also in another photographic installation, Oscar Martinez and his 2-year-old daughter, Valeria, 2 Salvadorians who died trying to cross the Rio Grande River from Mexico into the United States. And of course, Ireland is not without its presence in this exhibition as well. This is Willie Doherty's Belfast 1988 photograph, a whole series of photographs by Willie Doherty. And one of the things that it reminds us is the way in which walls become, in fact, become daily occurrences. They become part of their density becomes part of an everyday that we see all the time. Up and down its length and woven into the stone fabric of its fragments, the Berlin Wall has come to perform its own aesthetic topography. The graffiti that covered it prior to its fall in 1989 provided one kind of aesthetic skin, while the placement of sections large and small provide an open-air art museum. And Berlin is a museum for the fragments of the wall itself. Music, too, contributed extensively to the transformation of the Berlin Wall as an aesthetic text for history. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is not the only work that came to provide a narrative for the transformation of the Berlin Wall. It's one of the first pieces to be performed there, but it surely is remarkable for the ways in which its repeated performances sustain the role of that anniversary after anniversary, most recently on August 24th, 2019, when the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra commemorated the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, once again with a performance of the Ninth Symphony. Entire musical and dramatic works have been created to affect the wall's narratives of Germany's position in the world, among them the radio performance of Heiner Müller's and Heiner Goebbels' Wolokolamske Chaussee, about which I am preparing a volume for the 33 1/3 Europe series. Part 5, the aesthetics of the wall. Though they are meant violently to obstruct mobility, walls are often created as aesthetic objects. Historically, this aesthetic intent is evident in wall building projects throughout the world, the Great Wall of China, for example, the Ishtar Gate in ancient Babylon. Here you see it in Berlin at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. The outer wall of Vienna, which became a site for the architecture of the Wiener Moderne, some of the most exciting architecture enforces the outer wall of Vienna, which was originally created as a buttress against the attacking Ottoman Empire. As aesthetic objects, walls undergo transformations that both enhance and hide their original functions, affording them mobility of their own, for example, when they are placed in art museums. I witnessed such a transformation most recently while viewing the artworks chosen for the 2019 biennial at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York City, where Pat Phillips' The Farm took the form of a wall occupying a wall, representing the wall of the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola, infamous because of its incarceration of African Americans, also a prison in which many blues recordings were made. This is the installation. In his work, the Louisiana-based artist Phillips seeks the intersection at the center of aesthetic topographies to break down the distinctions between art and political representations, to mediate on complex questions of race, class, labor, and a militarized culture, as he claims. So you see here the way in which the wall of a prison is turned into an artwork that then occupies a museum itself. These repurposed, reimagined, and representational aesthetic functions for walls may even arrive at our doorsteps, as in the following two New Yorker covers that arrived on my doorstep last winter. Those of you, if any of you read The New Yorker, it's a wonderful magazine in the United States. The cover is always a subject for an artwork. And so here are two that came in January and March. And you can see the way in which the wall is turned into a very ironic type of artwork also here in only 6 weeks later. The aesthetics of the wall, therefore, depend on an uncanny longing to transform it into something positive and beautiful, something other than what it is as a force of separation and containment. To give a very striking example of this, I want to play the opening scenes from the film called Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog. It's a film by Alain Resnais from 1959 with the score, the musical score, composed by Hans Eisler. And what I want to show you in this, as you see these opening scenes, is that it's the first documentary of the concentration camp at Auschwitz, and you'll see the way in which walls absolutely intersect the landscape, and it becomes really, well, I'll let you watch it yourself, the way in which this aestheticizing process takes place.
Même un paysage tranquille, même une prairie avec des vols de corbeaux, des moissons et des feux d'herbe. Même une route où passent des voitures, des paysans, des couples, même un village pour vacances, avec une foire et un clocher peuvent conduire tout simplement à un camp de concentration. Le Struthof, Oranienburg, Auschwitz, Neuengamme, Belsen, Ravensbrück, Dachau furent des noms comme les autres sur les cartes et les guides. Le sang a caillé, les bouches se sont tues. Les blocs ne sont plus visités que par une caméra. Une drôle d'herbe a poussé et recouvert la terre usée par le piétinement des concentrationnaires. Le courant ne passe plus dans les fils électriques, plus aucun pas que le nôtre. « 1933. La machine se met en marche. Il faut une nation sans fausse note. Sans querelle. On se met au travail. Un camp de concentration se construit comme un stade ou un grand hôtel, avec des entrepreneurs, des devis, de la concurrence, sans doute des pots de vin. Pas de style imposé, c'est laissé à l'imagination. Style alpin, style garage, style japonais, sans style. Les architectes inventent calmement ces porches destinés à n'être franchis qu'une seule fois.
Part 6. The silence of the wall. The sounding of the wall. Does the wall itself sound? Do we experience it as a soundscape generating music of its own? Does its identity take on sonic and musical meaning? Are its narratives distinctive in some ways, and do they contribute to the historical longue durée and ethnographic present that converge in order to chart aesthetic topography of migration? In search of answers to such questions, I find myself thinking of walls as contact zones and border zones, which are themselves in various ways often cacophonous, filled with sounds. One might think of these as the mixtures of various others in need of sorting out. This is the sort of exchange that takes place at the walls of the city, where internal and external soundscapes overlap. It is such overlapping that I find to be of particular importance. I'd like to propose today that there is a symbolic language that accrues through music to walls, and that language has been crucial to generating the historical narrative with which we, as musical scholars, are concerned. The ways in which walls sound were in certain ways critical for the formation of the historical architecture of walls in Europe. City walls came particularly to form a bulwark against others, beyond European shores indeed, Africa, Asia, and above all, Islam. It was at the walls of Valencia, as told and sung in the Spanish national epic El Cid, that the Cid defended Spain against the invading armies of North African Muslims, thereby setting in motion the Reconquista. Here's an image and one of the ballads or romances within the epic of the Cid, as it's translated by Johann Gottfried Herder, the most important translation in Central Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries. But you can see this, the importance of the way in which music and battle takes place at the wall itself, as the marching armies approach. This is my translation from Herder. The tradition of representing the Cid's conquest and death sustains this idea of walls halting Muslim invaders. But we think of it elsewhere. For example, 1683, the siege of Vienna, of course. I've just talked about that wall. And no less of the European response to the current refugee crisis. The sound fabric of walls and pilgrims progressing is perhaps much more complex, but I believe much less discordant when song and prayer are mediated and projected by and around the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, where I do some field work. In the following video recording, we find ourselves at the confluence of many pilgrim routes, locally on the Via Dolorosa in the Arab quarter, but globally as we listen in a single moment toward European pilgrimage sites and Mecca. Many of you will know that I do a great deal of work on pilgrimage, and of course Jerusalem is one of those places. And so you see here, and I'm going to take us to the Austrian hospice, which I'll point out where it is. It's sort of the place where the road from St. Stephen's Gate and the Damascus Gate meet, and the Via Dolorosa begins just here. As clear as the walls are on the video you're about to see, and it's filled with walls, like the Louis Briard film that you saw. So too is the sacred sounds that they cannot interrupt. So I want you visually to see the walls, but aurally to listen to the way in which three different calls to prayer intersect and cross the walls. So this is in the garden of the Austrian hospice, which occupies this corner. This is an earlier image of it from the Middle Ages, and you can see again this sort of density even from the Middle Ages, in which walls were built upon walls were built upon walls. But I'm going to take you now to this moment. I'm trying to explain to some Israeli children the meaning of what they're hearing with some difficulty at that moment of difficulty of understanding on their part. Part 7, Walls in the Archaeology of Flight. Oops, there we go. Though they are built to give the impression of permanence and power, walls are breached. They fall, and they provide the foundations for new walls that signify new borders. Their traces remain, however, sometimes visible, sometimes invisible, as in the story of the concentration camp survivor Arthur Landau, the main character of H.G. Adler's novel, Die unsichtbare Wand, which was finally published in 1989. I raised this so it means the invisible wall, and it's a specific story of the concentration camps that Adler survived. Adler was a musicologist who wrote on Klopstock and music at the Charles University of Prague. He never practiced musicology. Even when enigmatic, the traces provide critical means of making the past legible, as for example in Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall. And there are the walls seen by only a small number of refugees, through which the main characters of Mohsin Hamid's 2017 novel Exit West flee in search of a place their migrant journey might end, a novel well worth your reading. Walls grow upon walls, and their historical narratives accumulate, lending themselves to the accruing processes of archaeology. The Stolpersteine, the stumbling stones that you see on the slide before you, lie on the street before the former house of the Katz family, Julia and Moritz, who became migrants, refugees, if we understand the term, interpret Flucht, flight etymologically, to mandatory Palestine in 1939. I chose these stones among thousands, tens of thousands in Berlin because the home in which the Katzes lived was across the street from the gate along the former city wall that opened toward the city of Cottbus. The Katz home no longer stands, and for the most part the city wall is survived only by the gates, the Hallisches Tor to Halle, Frankfurter Tor to Frankfurt an der Oder, etc., that provided means of transit through the walls. This is not quite the case in the Katz's former neighborhood, for two elevated subway lines now follow that wall at this point. And it's in Kreuzberg, especially in a neighborhood that is still the focus for the journey of migrants and refugees, now, of course, from the Middle East rather than to the Middle East. What remains are the traces and the potential for an archaeology of flight. The very materiality of the archaeological evidence finds its way into the song of the refugee as musical object and subject, as in this song by another Berlin refugee, actually two Berlin refugees from the Nazis, Hans Eisler and Bertolt Brecht, from 1938. And I wanted to play a song. This is performed by my cabaret ensemble, the New Budapest Orpheum Society. You're going to hear the wonderful mezzo-soprano Julia Bentley. So this is called An den kleinen Radioapparat, to the little radio.
Kleiner Kasten, den ich flüchtend trug, dass meine Lampen mir auch nicht zerbrechen, besorgt vom Haus zum Schiff, vom Schiff zum Zug, dass meine Feinde weiter zu mir sprechen. An meinem Lager und zu meiner Pein, der letzte Nachts, der ersten in der Früh. Von ihren Siegen und von meiner Mühe, versprich mir nicht auf einmal stumm zu sein.
I should acknowledge that Julia Bentley, in her day job, is professor of voice at Indiana University. The archaeology of flight finds form also in musical genre, and we've been actually experiencing that throughout my comments today. And particularly the versions and variants, the printed broadsides and inscribed recordings that become the archaeological covers of the historical longue durée. Movement across the border between Mexico and Texas, for example, has engendered its own genre, the corrido. As a ballad, the corrido is narrative in form and functions, its verses framing the episodes of a story and the chapters of a long history of border crossing. Corridos frequently circulate in printed form as broadside ballads and as recorded forms, and these together provide the materiality for their archaeology. I want to play an early recorded example. This is from 1921, called El Corrido de Texas, the Corrido of Texas. Just to give you a sense of its sound.
Ya me voy para esa agencia a pasearme por el norte y para hacerle su asistencia en la parte donde estés. Me escribes, no seas ingrato, y en contestación te mando de recuerdos mi retrato.
The corrido has its origins in the late Middle Ages, in Spanish romances, and with ballads themselves. Also follows other paths with other genres, especially the decima, which is also a ballad form with narratives, but it's specifically about crossing borders. The corrido, of course, denies and destabilizes the purported silencing that the current American administration would like to impose by building a wall along the border with Mexico. It cannot undo the violence of that wall, but the ballads about border crossing can sound an alternative narrative, and even more important, allow us to confront history more expansively. And we witness this in the work of Alex Chavez, for example. But I wanted to show you a way in which genre also creates new genres. In this case, the trap corrido, which is a fairly new form of the corrido in which trap music, mostly from the American Southeast, combines with corridos to create new genres. Part 7, Songs Return to History. Quite deliberately, I have chosen narrative genres of song to provide much of the musical evidence for my reflections today. Formally, ballads and corridos rely on the borders and gateways, implicit and explicit in strophic structures. The formal conventions of musical narrative, moreover, are critical for the ways in which song affixes itself to history and then returns in the archaeological layers of the longue durée. As I begin to approach my conclusion, therefore, I return to the historical past and the historical present through song. And I do so with a ballad that Johann Gottfried Herder published in several variants at the beginning of his first folio of Volkslieder, folk songs, in 1778. Because ballads as a narrative structure with specific linguistic histories, such as the Jewish women you heard before, the Edward ballad, which some of you might know also in the Brahms setting, which is taken directly from Herder in Opus 10, were the first to capture Herder's attention. It might not seem surprising that Herder should include the Spanish romance, or ballad known as Zaid and Zaida, as the 8th song in his folk songs, and that he would include several variants. And you see one of them here. This is song number 8 in the Volkslieder published in 1778. The history of this ballad, Zaid and Zaida, however, is far more complex and global than first meets the eye. Herder's source for this variant of Zaid and Zaida was a 17th century historical ballad and written in history by Ginés Pérez de Hita in 1647. The ballad's origins are in medieval Al-Andalus, and like other early ballads from the Mediterranean Middle Ages, the narrative moves through many languages in oral and written tradition. In the case of Zaid and Zaida, Arabic, and several Romance languages. Among other reasons, Herder was attracted to the song because of its etymological relation to the Cid epic, which he had also translated, as you saw earlier, into German. Zaid and Said are both Arabic predecessors to the name Cid. The history Herder might have attempted to realize by publishing variants of Zaid and Zaida in the 1770s, however, would move in directions even he might not have imagined, and that is one reason I employ it here to illustrate a modern moment of returning song to history. As a narrative ballad with a captivity narrative, The story of the lovers, Said and Saida, also captured the attention of writers and musicians in Enlightenment Europe, among them Jean-Philippe Rameau and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who set to work on the Singspiel Saida in 1780, using Herder's text, of course. In arias and ensemble components, were eventually gathered as K344, but there is no overture or third act, thus leaving the Singspiel incomplete. Saida's narrative remained open, and it surely influenced that best known of operas with a captivity narrative, Mozart's Entführung aus dem Serail, K384, which was premiered in 1782, 2 years later. It is the unfinished history of Saida that further opens the possibility that it might return in the moment of the 21st century refugee crisis faced by so many from the Mediterranean, African, and Middle East today, with contemporary performances that extend the Andalusian, Arabic, Spanish, Herderian, Mozartian history to the present. In these performances across Germany, called Saide, eine Flucht, Said, a refugee's journey. It is in fact Flüchtlinge, refugees seeking refuge in Europe who weave their histories into a new libretto and performance in Europe. They interweave improvised recitatives about daily dangers and the difficulties of crossing borders that have been fenced into the arias and ensemble songs composed by Mozart for Saida. These refugee and non-refugees, modern operatic performers, return to history just as history returns to their world, our world. And I want to give you just a brief look at a rehearsal of this performance of refugees and opera singers performing this new work. You'll have, the translation is in the right column here.
Das war das einzige Mal in diesem Land, dass ich gut schlafen konnte.
Es gibt nicht genug zu essen, es gibt nicht genug zu trinken. Die Bauern bauen nichts mehr an. Importe gibt es keine, es herrscht der Krieg.
Du bist verrückt, aber es steht auf der Liste der Volksfreunde ganz oben. Denn er war gegen den Mauerbau.
Er wollte die Grenze öffnen.
Aber spätestens seit dem Austritt Griechenlands und Großbritanniens aus der EU war klar, dass Grenzen wieder eine große Bedeutung bekommen.
Strangers drive us across the border together.
Syrian refugees sing Mozart.
In a minivan, painted black.
Part 9, the final part. Lifted up from the earth at the very moment of death. I conclude my reflections today by returning to my beginning, returning to Herder and the history of song, thus again returning song to history. I do so by returning to the final passage in Herder's last major essay on song, the chapter called Von Musik, on music, from Collegane of 1800. I began with Herder's reflections on the moment of song, and I close with his final return to the history of song. I quote, "If one gathers without any prejudice the affects that melodies and songs invest in human feeling, and afford to all collectivities of human society, from the family to the nation, music would rise as a narrative of miraculous tales from the lowest rung to which it has been assigned to realize its relation to the culture of humanities. The concepts of music come from transitory impressions. Either they disappear entirely, or if they are deliberately repeated from the strength of imagination, they are more burdensome than unpleasant. As we know so very well, it is music that we experience within ourselves that lifts us up from the earth at the very moment of death. End of citation. For us today in Limerick, music scholars mustering multiple perspectives, Johann Gottfried Herder's chapter on music in Colligine is remarkable as a summation of his understanding of a much larger epistemology of music and the human, in which folk music and art music are not fundamentally separable. He consciously takes up the work on folk song from a quarter century earlier once again, realizing a return to history that is crucial to the process of transmission. Upon returning song to history, Herder envisioned a collectivity of choral singing and community dance. I quote, "We cannot listen often enough. We cannot listen often enough to the intimate passages that move us, how they echo, and we wish for their return without satisfaction, until we, so we imagine, absorb these passages and they become part of our soul." End of citation. For Herder, returning song to history becomes more focused and more human, while at the same time the range of music's metaphysics becomes more expansive and more transcendent. There is so much at stake for us in Herder's late reflections on the confluence of song and history as he approaches the final stages of his life, which he hesitates not to call that moment also a moment of death. That moment contains humanity and the universe, life and death. It is the return of song to history, to humanity, that draws its aesthetic topography together, affording it the power of passage when confronted by walls and borders. Song and history, which live through their return, however transitory, are endowed with remarkable force, the very power to realize life itself, and to do so at the moment in which music is transcendent. Thank you so very much.